Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about surveying and sampling, particularly looking at things like how we pick our samples and bias, and then looking at how we might generalize some of those results that we find. Now, to really understand how to prevent things like bias, you need to understand the people that you're looking at and why you might be looking at those and for what reason, right? So if I wanted to, let's say, find out the favourite subjects of all Year 8 students, it's going to be really difficult for me to go out and interview every Year 8 student around the world. And so what I might do is I might pick a representative sample instead. So in that case, if that was my study that I wanted to do, my population might be all Year 8 students, right? But I know it's really not realistic for me to go and interview them. So I'm instead going to pick what we call a sample, and that's a subset of the population group. Okay, and there's a couple of different ways that we might sample. The first is by what we call a simple random sample, and this is just selecting randomly from the population. Okay, so I might do this just through a random number generator, so a random list generator, and then from there I might send out surveys to those people given that that was ethical to do. The next one is a stratified sample. And so that's if the population you're looking at has more than one group. Okay, so if I'm looking at Year 8 students, I might look at Year 8 students in Australia. I might look at Year 8 students in Europe, Year 8 students in America, and then sample randomly from those groups. If, let's say, I was just looking at the Year 8 students in Australia, I could do it by state and randomly select from those groups, or I could do it by private versus public school as well and randomly select from those groups. So stratified sampling tends to be more representative of the population because you split it up into those smaller groups and then select randomly from there. The other one that's really commonly used is what we call our convenience sample, and that's from easily available data. Okay, so I might, because I can't interview every Year 8 student, I might just interview my Year 8 maths class, right? Or my 2 Year 8 maths classes if I've got those. But then I would just have to be really careful of things like gender balance, or if I'm interviewing them on their favourite subject and they haven't actually completed all the subjects yet, things like that, and the different experiences those students are having. Now, the reason we like to do things like stratified sampling is to avoid things like bias, right? If I was to want to find out the favourite subject of, let's say, all students, all high school students, and then I was just to interview Year 8 students, that's going to be quite biased because they've had a very different experience from, let's say, the Year 11 or 12 students. So we like to avoid that by either having our population be smaller or by doing things like stratified sampling. Now, the other thing we need to understand when it comes to surveying and sampling is the kinds of skew that we might have. Now, if I've got symmetrical data, which is usually what we sort of aim for, it looks like a curve, and we call this a bell curve. And what that means is that our mean is usually very, very close, if not equal to our median, right? And then we've got negatively skewed data, which tends to kind of climb upwards. And I know that that's a bit opposite to what we were doing with our linear graphs, where we would call this a positive gradient, right? But it's negatively skewed because a lot of our beginning values are on the lower frequency, right? And so what this does mean is our mean tends to be lower than our median, right? Whereas positively skewed, our mean tends to be greater than our median, right? And then we have bimodal, where we kind of get multiple hills. And that just means that we could have a mean or a median that are similar, but there's not always going to be a trend that we're seeing in that case. Now, the reason we like to do things like surveying and sampling is so that instead of asking thousands upon thousands of people like we do at a census, we might just select a small group that we try to have representative of a population. And so here we've got 40 randomly selected adults, and we've talked about how many children they would like to have. And then we've collated that data and made it into a frequency graph. And we can see that our graph here, which tends to be the case with numerical data, is a bell curve, right? Now, we're going to assume that we have taken a sample that is representative of the population. So we've taken into account things like gender, age, jobs, location, etc. Now, if we were going to assume this is representative of the population, then we can generalize this data and apply those 40 randomly selected to the whole population. And so if I'm looking at the proportion of adults who are likely to have 4 or more children, well, 4 was 6 out of the 40 and 5 was 3 out of the 40. And so I end up with 6 plus 3 over 40 being 9 over 40. Now, if I'm looking at a group of 8,000 adults that I assume this sample is representing, and I want to find out how many I would expect to have no children, well, I'm going to look at how many have no children, being the 4, so that's 4 out of 40, being 1/10. And if I want to find out of 8,000 how many are likely to have no children or would want to have no children, I'm going to multiply that by 8,000, and that's going to give me 800 adults. Okay. Now, we mentioned at the start of this that our graph here is quite symmetrical. You could say that it has a, you could say that it has like a very slight negative skew. However, in this case, I would be calling this graph symmetrical because it's got that quite distinct bell curve shape. Now, the other thing we have to consider now is how we could make sure that we avoid bias. So we have to think of things that are likely to lead to bias. And I was quite impressed with my class when I asked them this because they were shooting rapid fire answers, right? And one of those methods that would lead to bias is things like school drop-off and pickup, right? If you go to people who already have children and you say, how many children would you like? Well, it's going to definitely vary. Things like age as well, everyone's life experiences over time, situations, so things like poverty, war, could make people want less children, right? And then things like their previous family size as well. If you've come from a large family, you're more likely to actually want more children because that's the experience you've had growing up. And so we would have to look into these and try and pick out maybe some people who are doing school drop-off, but making sure not all of them are, having a range of ages, a range of incomes, family sizes, etc., to just avoid having, if let's say I interviewed people who were at school drop-off and they were wanting, they've already got 2 children and they're quite happy, we'd have that 2 being a lot higher. And so we want to avoid having that bias and kind of reaching this very symmetrical shape.